Nobody is afraid of the librarian. That is the first thing you need to understand about how I did what I did. Not the evidence, not the patience, not the 12 years. The first thing is that nobody looks twice at the woman behind the reference desk. Nobody lowers their voice when she walks into the room. Nobody thinks to wonder what she knows or what she has been keeping or what she has been building in the silence that everyone around her produces so effortlessly, because they have decided she is furniture. I spent my whole career being furniture. I cultivated it. I understand now that I was cultivating it long before I had a reason to. The way some people are born knowing how to be still in the dark. It is a gift, that stillness. It took me a long time to understand what it was for. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 54 years old. I have been a librarian for 29 years, first in Clarksburg and then back in Maple Grove, where I grew up. I cataloged books, and I helped people find things, and I answered questions, and I was pleasant, and I was forgettable, and I was exactly what I needed to be. My sister's name was Ruth. She was 4 years younger than me, and she was nothing like me. Where I was still, she was motion. Where I faded into rooms, she occupied them. She laughed at things that other people took seriously, and she took seriously things that other people dismissed. She had a quality of attention that made you feel, when she turned it toward you, like being lit from the inside. She was afraid of water. I want to say that clearly before anything else. Ruth Voss had been afraid of water since the summer she was 7 and nearly drowned in the public pool in Maple Grove and was pulled out by a lifeguard, who was 16, and who she later told me she barely remembered because she had been so far under when he reached her. After that summer, she did not swim. She did not go in water above her knees. She did not stand at the edge of things. She was not embarrassed about the fear. She talked about it plainly when it came up. She said water, and I have an understanding, and the understanding is that I stay out of it. She was 26 years old when she drowned in the lake behind her house in Maple Grove. The official record says accidental drowning. The official record says she was alone on the dock and fell in and was not found until the following morning. The official record was written by people who believed what her husband told them, which was that he had been asleep inside and had not known she was out on the dock and had found her in the water when he went to look for her at dawn. Her husband's name was Dean Callister. He was 31 years old, and he was handsome, and he was well-liked, and he had a way of being in a room that made people feel comfortable, and he cried at her funeral in a way that made everyone around him cry, too. And he carried her casket, and he thanked people for coming with a warmth that the whole town of Maple Grove found genuine and moving. I stood at that funeral, and I watched him, and I felt something settle in my chest that was not grief, or not only grief. Grief I had. Grief was there, and it was real, and it was the specific grief of losing the only person in the world who had known me my whole life and who I would spend the rest of my life wishing I could call. What settled alongside the grief was something colder. Something that did not have a name yet, but that I recognized the shape of. The shape of something wrong that had been made to look like something else. Ruth did not go on docks alone at night. Ruth did not go near water at all unless she had to. Ruth, who had been afraid of water since she was 7 years old, had not walked out onto a dock in the dark by herself. That was not Ruth. That was not the woman I had known for 26 years. That was not the woman who told me 3 months before she died that she was scared of Dean in a way she could not explain, but that she needed me to know. She had called me in August. I remember the exact quality of the light through my window in Clarksburg when the phone rang. She said she did not want to alarm me. She said things were probably fine. She said she just needed to tell someone she trusted that she sometimes felt afraid in her own house, and that she did not know what to do with that. I asked her what she was afraid of. She said she did not know exactly. She said Dean had changed. She said there were things she had noticed that she could not explain. She said he had taken out a large insurance policy on her life recently, and she had found that paperwork. And when she asked him about it, he had said it was just good financial planning, and he had seemed irritated. That she asked, and she had not asked again. I asked her if she wanted to leave. She was quiet for a moment. She said she did not know. She said she might be making things up. She said Dean was good to her most of the time, and she did not want to be the woman who ran away from a marriage because of a feeling. I told her feelings were information. She said she knew. She said she would call me again soon. She said she loved me. That was the last conversation I had with my sister. 6 weeks later, I was driving to Maple Grove for her funeral. I am going to tell you about the anger first, and then I am going to tell you why I set it down. When the police closed the file as accidental, I felt the kind of anger that starts in your chest and spreads outward until it is in your hands and your jaw and the back of your eyes. The kind of anger that wants to do something, anything, that matches the size of what happened. I wanted to go to the police station and put everything on the table and demand that someone listen. I wanted to call the newspapers. I wanted to stand up at Dean Callister's next public appearance and say to everyone around him what I knew in my chest to be true. I did none of those things. Not because I was afraid, because I was thinking. Anger is loud. Loud things are visible. Visible things can be managed. Dean Callister had already managed his own visibility very well, and he had the whole town of Maple Grove believing the version of events he had provided, and if I stood up and made noise, the story that would attach to me was already written. A grieving sister, the woman who could not accept the accident, the one who needed someone to blame and had chosen the widower because he was close. That story was already available. I could feel it waiting for me like a costume. If I put it on by losing my temper or making accusations, I could not prove. I would wear it for years, and it would make everything I knew invisible, and Dean Callister would walk through his life without consequence. So I did something harder than anger. I got quiet. I got strategic. I went back to Clarksburg, and I went back to work, and I let the months pass, and I thought about what I actually had, and what I actually needed, and what the difference between them was. What I had was a phone call. Ruth's voice in August saying she was scared. Ruth's mention of the insurance policy, and my own knowledge, bone deep and certain, that my sister, who was afraid of water, had not walked out onto a dock alone at night. What I needed was everything else. The documentation, the timeline, the evidence that existed somewhere if I could find it. Evidence does not disappear. It goes quiet. It waits in files and accounts and records, and the memories of people who were not asked the right questions. My job was to find it. My job was to be patient enough and quiet enough and good enough at finding things to locate every piece of it and assemble it in a way that could not be dismissed. I was a librarian. Finding things was the only thing I had ever been trained to do. I started that autumn. The first thing I found was the insurance policy. Ruth had told me about it, but I needed the documentation. I contacted the insurance company through a series of steps I had thought through carefully, and I was told. Eventually, the basics of what existed. A life insurance policy on Ruth Callister, taken out 14 days before her death. A payout that went to Dean Callister as the named beneficiary within 3 months of the death determination. 14 days. He had insured her life 14 days before she died. I wrote the number down, the date, the amount. I put it in a folder. That folder was the beginning of what became over 12 years. A filing system that occupied most of a spare room in my apartment in Clarksburg. 12 years of folders. Each one labeled, each one containing exactly what it said it contained. The second thing I found was harder. Ruth had been writing letters in the months before her death. Not many and not too many people, but she had written a few, and some of them had been received by people who were still findable if you were patient and methodical and willing to follow the trail as far as it went. I spent 8 months tracking those letters. I found 3 of the recipients. 2 of them had nothing significant in what Ruth had written. The third had something I had not expected. Ruth had written to a woman named Patricia, a former coworker from a job she had held before her marriage, and in that letter, which Patricia had kept in a shoebox and which she handed to me at her kitchen table in Decatur, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask for it, Ruth had written about her fear in a way she had not been able to say out loud on the phone with me. She wrote that Dean had told her once, during an argument, that accidents happen to people who were not careful. She wrote that she had not understood what he meant at the time and had tried to convince herself it was nothing. She wrote that she had thought about it since, and that she was not convinced anymore that it was nothing. She had written it 3 weeks before she died. Patricia had given a statement to the police at the time of Ruth's death. She had mentioned the letter. The investigating officer had noted it and moved on. The letter had never been formally obtained. It was in a shoebox in Decatur, and nobody had asked for it after the initial interview. I asked for it. Patricia gave it to me with both hands and something in her face that looked like relief. like she had been holding it for someone and had finally been found. I put it in a folder. I flew home. I thought about what else existed that nobody had asked for. The caregiver's name was Beverly. She had worked for Dean's grandmother in the years before his marriage to Ruth, and she had left that position abruptly and had not spoken publicly about the circumstances of her departure. Finding her took 3 years. She was living in a small town outside Springfield when I found her. She was 63, and she had not thought about Dean Callister in a long time, and she was not immediately interested in thinking about him again. I drove to Springfield twice before she agreed to meet me. She met me at a diner. She ordered coffee and did not drink it, and she looked at me across the table with the look of a woman assessing how much something is going to cost her. I told her what I was doing. I told her about Ruth. I told her about the insurance policy and the letter and the 12 years. I told her I was not a police officer and I was not a reporter, and I was not going to use her name for anything without her explicit permission. I said I was a librarian from Clarksburg who was trying to understand what happened to her sister. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Dean Callister had stolen money from the grandmother while Beverly was working there. Not a large amount, but enough to matter. She said she had figured it out, and when she confronted him about it, he had become frightening in a way she could not fully describe. She said he had not threatened her exactly. He had looked at her in a way that made clear that he had considered what her options were and had found them limited. She had quit the following week and had not spoken about it since. She said she had not known about Ruth until she heard about the drowning years later in passing from a mutual acquaintance. She said she had thought about whether she should say something. She said she had told herself it was not her place. I said I understood. I said I was not there to make her feel guilty. I said I was asking because I needed to understand the complete picture of who this man was, and she was part of that picture. She said she would think about giving a formal statement. She said she would think about it for a few weeks. 7 months later, she called me and said she was ready. I had her number in the folder labeled Beverly, and I had been patient, and I answered on the second ring. I want to tell you about returning to Maple Grove because it is the part of this that required the most of me, and I think it deserves honesty. 12 years after Ruth's death, I applied for and was offered the position of head librarian at the Maple Grove Public Library. It was not a coincidence. I had been watching for an opportunity, and the opportunity had arrived, and I had prepared for the interview the way I prepared for everything in those years. Carefully, without leaving things to chance. I had everything I needed except one thing. I needed to understand Dean Callister's current life well enough to know how to present what I had assembled to the people who needed to receive it. I needed to know who the new people in his life were, what his standing in the community was, what vulnerabilities existed in the story he had been telling for 12 years. I needed proximity. He had remarried. A woman named Miriam, 4 years after Ruth's death. They had a daughter. He had expanded his business in Maple Grove and was well regarded in the usual ways of men who are well regarded in small towns through participation and visibility and the careful management of how he was perceived. I became part of the community. I ran the library, which meant I knew every program and every event and eventually every person who came through the doors regularly. Maple Grove is not a large town. Becoming known in it is not difficult if you are patient and pleasant and willing to be present without demanding attention. I met Miriam through the library's Tuesday reading group. She was quiet and bookish, and I liked her in spite of everything, or maybe because of everything. I could see in her the same quality I had heard in Ruth's voice in August 12 years before. Not fear exactly, wariness. The particular watchfulness of a woman who has learned to pay attention, without knowing fully what she is paying attention to. I did not rush. I was not there to make Miriam into anything. I was there to find out what was true and to make it available to people who could act on it. But I watched Miriam, and I watched the way she moved around Dean, and I took note, and I put it in the folder marked Maple Grove Observations, and I continued. Dean did not recognize me. I had not expected him to. He had met me twice, briefly, in the period of his marriage to Ruth, and I had been peripheral on both occasions in the way I was always peripheral, and he was not a man who paid attention to women who did not require his attention. I was the librarian. His furniture was exactly where I needed to be. The moment I decided the time had come was a Tuesday evening in February. 3 years after I moved to Maple Grove, I was closing the library alone. The last patron had left, and I was checking the returns, and I found a book that had been misshelved, and I was walking it back to its correct location, and I passed the window that looked out onto the parking lot, and I saw Dean Callister's car pull up and park, and he got out, and he stood by his car for a moment, and he did not know. I was watching him, and in that moment, in the particular way that long accumulated knowledge sometimes resolves into a single clear image, I saw him very plainly. He was 53 years old. He had grayed at the temples in the way that makes men in small towns look distinguished. He was wearing a good coat, and he looked like exactly what 12 years of successful living had made him look like. He did not look like someone who had killed his wife. He looked like someone who had always gotten away with it and who knew that he would continue to get away with it for the rest of his life. I stood at the window and I looked at him and I thought about Ruth, about August, about the way she said she loved me at the end of that last call, about the phone call that never came because she was 6 weeks from the moment on the dock and she did not know it and I did not know it and nobody had done anything to stop it. I thought about 12 years of folders, about Patricia's shoebox, about Beverly in the diner saying she had thought about whether she should say something, about the insurance policy and the 14 days. I had everything. I had been waiting for the feeling that I had everything, and the feeling had arrived. I finished shelving the book. I put on my coat. I drove home. I opened the filing cabinet in the spare room and I sat with the folders for an hour, going through them in order, making sure each piece was where it should be. They were. Everything was where it should be. Everything had always been where it should be. The following morning I made 2 calls. The first was to a detective in the county sheriff's office named Victor Okafor, who had transferred to the department 2 years earlier, and whose name I had noted because he had a reputation for taking cold cases seriously. The second was to a victims' rights attorney in Kansas City named Sandra Pruitt, who I had been watching for 3 years for exactly this moment. I said I had information regarding a potential homicide that had been classified as an accidental death 12 years ago. I said I had documentation I believed was relevant to a reconsideration of that classification. I said I was prepared to provide everything I had to the appropriate people. Victor Okafor said he would meet me the following day. Sandra Pruitt said she would drive from Kansas City. I said thank you to both of them, and I hung up, and I sat in my kitchen, and I drank my coffee, and I thought about nothing for a while. The work was done. Everything that was mine to do had been done. What came next was not mine to do, and I was at peace with that. The investigation that followed moved in the slow and deliberate way that serious investigations move. Victor Okafor was thorough. He pulled the original file, and he read it in the way that Marcus Threlkeld had read the cold case file in another story in another state, line by line, asking the questions that the original investigation had not asked. He spoke to Beverly. He located Patricia and obtained a formal copy of the letter. He subpoenaed the financial records from the insurance company and from the bank accounts that had existed at the time of Ruth's death. He spoke to 3 neighbors from the lake house who had originally been interviewed and who had given statements that were in the original file and who now, 12 years later, gave him the same information with the addition of details they had not been asked about the first time. One of those details was significant. A neighbor named Tom, who had lived 2 properties from the lake house, said he had seen a light in the house very early on the morning of Ruth's death. Not the light that would indicate someone walking to the dock. A light in a back room, on briefly and then off, at approximately 2 in the morning. He had noted it and forgotten it, and when Victor Okafor asked him specifically about the hours between midnight and 5 that morning, he remembered. The light did not prove anything by itself. The medical examiner's original report had established a time of death that was consistent with the early morning hours. The light, combined with the insurance policy and the letter in Beverly's account and the financial records, began to form a picture that was more difficult to explain away than Dean Callister's account had ever had to be. Dean was brought in for questioning. He was cooperative and calm, and he told the same story he had told 12 years before. He had been asleep. He had not heard her go out. He had found her in the morning. He said it with the same practiced fluency he had used at the original interview, and he did not appear to understand that the fluency itself had become part of the evidence against him. A man who tells the same story 12 years later with identical precision has been rehearsing that story. People who are remembering a real thing remember it with the usual variations of human memory. People who have constructed a story remember it exactly. Victor Okafor noted this. He noted it in the file, and he noted it to Sandra Pruitt, and he noted it to the district attorney who eventually made the decision to move forward. Miriam was the piece I had worried about most. Not in the investigation, in the human sense. She was a woman who had built a life with a man who had done what he had done, and she did not know it. And when she found out, everything she had built on that foundation was going to have to be reconsidered. I told her before the formal announcement. I asked Victor Okafor's permission, and he granted it because he understood that the information was going to reach her one way or another, and that hearing it from me was better than hearing it from a news report. I sat across from her at the library after closing on a Thursday. I had made tea. She sat with her hands around the cup, and she looked at me with the particular alertness of a person who knows that what is coming is going to be large. I told her about Ruth. I told her about August. I told her about the insurance policy, and the letter, and Beverly, and the 12 years. I told her clearly and without dramatizing, and I watched her face change as the information reached her in layers. She did not fall apart. That surprised me a little, and it should not have because I had been watching her for 3 years, and I knew the quality of steadiness in her. She sat with what I told her for a long time. She asked questions. Good questions, specific and practical. The questions of a woman who is already beginning to assess what she needs to do next. She asked at the end whether I had moved to Maple Grove specifically for this. I said yes. She said she had thought something was happening, but she had not known what. She said she had sensed something in my attention that she could not explain. She said she was glad I had told her before the arrest. I said I was sorry for what she was going to go through. She said she was sorry about Ruth. She said she was a practical woman and she would figure out what came next. She said her daughter was going to need a great deal of support. She picked up her tea. She drank it. She set the cup down. She thanked me for telling her. I walked her to her car. The night was cold. The parking lot of the Maple Grove Public Library was empty. She drove away, and I stood in the cold for a moment, and I thought about Ruth, and I thought about Miriam, and I thought about all the women in all the orbits of men like Dean Callister, who live their lives carrying information they have not yet been given permission to have. Dean Callister was arrested on a Monday morning at his office. He was in a meeting when the officers arrived. He saw Victor Okafor first, and his face did something in that moment. A very brief recalibration. And then he was composed again, and he said he had no idea what this was about, and he needed to call his attorney. Victor Okafor later told me that in his experience, the most telling thing about an arrest was the first half-second. Before the person had time to perform, the half-second in which the body responds to what the mind already knows. He said Dean Callister's half-second had told him everything. The trial lasted 11 days. I was in the courtroom every day. I sat in the gallery, and I was quiet, and I watched the evidence I had spent 12 years assembling be presented by people whose job it was to present it, and I let them do their job without adding anything of my own. Sandra Pruitt sat next to me on 2 of the days. She did not need to be there by that point, but she came anyway. She said it was the most patient investigation she had ever been part of, and that the patience had made the difference. She said most cases fell apart because someone moved too early. She said I had not moved too early. I said I had had a good teacher. She asked who. I said 12 years. The jury was out for 2 days. They came back on a Thursday afternoon. The foreperson read the verdict in the flat, clear voice of someone who has reached a conclusion they are sure of. Guilty of murder in the 1st degree. I did not make a sound. I sat in the gallery and I held it, and I let it be what it was. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly. Something more like the feeling of a very long sentence finally reaching its period. The ending that had always been the right ending finally arrived. Dean Callister turned in his seat before they let him out. He looked at the gallery. I do not know what he was looking for. He found me. His eyes settled on my face, and I saw the moment of recognition, the moment where he understood who I was and what I had done, and how long I had been doing it without him ever knowing. I looked at him steadily. I did not smile. I did not look away. He looked away first. They let him out, and he was gone, and I sat in the courtroom for a few minutes after the room began to clear. I thought about Ruth. about the way she laughed at things other people took seriously, about the phone call in August, and the way she said she loved me. I said her name once, quietly, to no one in particular. Ruth. Just her name. The name that had been on a file marked accidental for 12 years, and that was now, finally, on the correct file. I am still the librarian in Maple Grove. I did not leave when it was over. There was no reason to leave. The job was real, and the community was real, and the library was full of people who needed the things that libraries provide, and I was good at providing them. Miriam left Maple Grove. She took her daughter to her mother's place in Indiana, and I understand. She has rebuilt her life there in the way that practical people rebuild things. We exchanged one letter after the trial. It was brief and honest on both sides, and we have not been in contact since. I think that is the right amount. Victor Okafor was promoted within the department. Sandra Pruitt sent me a card after the sentencing. Beverly from Springfield sent flowers to the library without a note, just flowers, and I understood what they were for. Patricia Indicator called me after the verdict. She said she was glad she had kept the letter. I told her keeping it had mattered. She said she had always thought it might. We talked for a while about Ruth, about who she had been, the version of her that existed before Dean. The version I had known my whole life. It was the first time in 12 years. I had talked about that version of my sister with someone who had also known her, and it was not as painful as I had expected. It was something closer to good. I cataloged a new collection of biographies last fall. I reshelved the reference section in October. I ordered a replacement for a set of encyclopedias that had been falling apart since before I arrived. I did the things that need doing in a library, the quiet, persistent maintenance of something that is meant to hold knowledge and make it accessible to whoever needs it. Ruth's name is on a bench in the small park behind the library. I applied for the bench dedication after the trial. The town of Maple Grove approved it without opposition. The bench has a small plaque that says Ruth Voss Callister and the years of her birth and death and nothing else, which is how I wanted it. People sit on it without knowing whose name is there. Children play near it. The bench exists and the name is on it, and that is enough. I visit it on Tuesday evenings after the library closes. I sit for a while. I do not talk to her. I am not a mystical person. I just sit with her name in stone, and I let that be what it is. The truth has weight in stone. That is something I have found to be consistently true. You can deny the truth in a courtroom, and you can perform it away, and you can outrun it for 12 years with a good story and a charming manner, and the willingness of a town to believe the crying widower. But the truth is still there. It goes quiet, not gone. It waits in files and shoeboxes and the memories of caregivers and diners. It waits for the person who is patient enough and quiet enough and good enough at finding things. I was that person. For Ruth, I was exactly that person. Nobody is afraid of the librarian. That is still true. That is still the thing that made all of it possible. But the librarian found everything. The librarian always finds everything. That is what libraries are for. My name is Eleanor Voss. My sister's name was Ruth. Her name is on a bench in Maple Grove now. That is enough. That is everything. That is the whole story. I keep returning to who Ruth was because the trial made her into evidence, and the coverage made her into a victim, and both of those things are true, and neither of them is the most true thing about her. She was the person in a room who asked the question everyone else was thinking but had decided not to ask. She did it without malice and without performance. She just looked at the situation and said the thing that was plainly there to say and let other people catch up. Some people found this tiring. The people who found it tiring were usually the ones who had something to protect from direct examination. She made the best biscuits of anyone I have ever known. I say this knowing it sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. The ability to make a thing that people want to eat is an act of love repeated until it becomes a craft, and Ruth had been making biscuits since she was 12 and learning from our grandmother, and by the time she was an adult, they were the kind of thing that people requested and remembered and that arrived at gatherings with the weight of expectation. She brought biscuits to Dean's family the first time she met them. She brought biscuits to the neighbors when we cleaned out our mother's house. She brought biscuits to me when I had a hard week in Clarksburg. She showed up with biscuits the way some people show up with condolences, the way some people show up with judgment. She showed up with the practical offering of warmth in a specific and useful form. She was also funny. not performatively. The kind of funny that sneaks up on you, a timing thing, a precision of observation that produced the joke before you could see it coming. She and I had a shorthand humor that had developed over a lifetime of shared references and shared history, and that nobody outside the two of us fully understood. I miss that humor more than I can say. There is a specific kind of conversation that can only exist between two people who have known each other since before they had language for what they knew, and when one of those people is gone, the conversation cannot continue with anyone else. The other person is left speaking half of a dialogue into silence. I have been speaking half of a dialogue into silence for 12 years. I will do it for the rest of my life. That is the cost of what Dean Callister did that the verdict cannot account for. The cost in the ongoing daily sense. The jokes that have no one to finish them, the biscuits that nobody brings. I put that cost in the folder too. Not literally, but I held it all 12 years the same way I held the insurance policy and the letter and Beverly's account. I held it as part of what needed to be answered for. It could not be answered for in the conventional sense. No verdict restores a shorthand. No sentence brings back the biscuits. But the truth is in the record. The name is on the bench. The file no longer says accidental. That is what was available. I took everything that was available. People ask me sometimes how I sustained it for 12 years. They are usually asking about motivation. How do you stay focused on something for that long? How do you keep coming back to it year after year without losing the thread? The question assumes it was hard to sustain. It was not hard to sustain. It was simply part of my life, the way work is part of a life. I went to my job. I helped people find things. I came home. I worked on the folders. I followed the threads. The two activities did not feel separate to me. They were both the same skill, the same quality of attention, applied to different materials. At the library, I found information for people who needed it. In the spare room, I found information for Ruth, who needed it. The practice of the library actually helped with the Ruth investigation in specific ways that I have thought about. Librarians are trained to evaluate sources. We are trained to understand that information exists in layers. The surface layer is what a record says it says. The layer beneath that is what the record actually reveals when you read it in the context of every other record you have. The layer beneath that is what the record does not say. The absence that becomes visible only when you know what should be there and can see that it is missing. Dean Callister's story had been accepted at the surface layer. Everyone who had evaluated it had read it as it presented itself and found it consistent. I read it at the second and third layer. I read it in the context of the insurance policy and the letter and Ruth's fear and my knowledge of who she was. At those layers, it was not consistent. At those layers, it was full of things that should not have been there and things that should have been there and were absent. That is library work. That is the same skill applied to a different kind of collection. The 12 years were also 12 years of becoming the kind of person who could do what I eventually did in Maple Grove. Moving there required a level of composure and patience and strategic thinking that I am not sure I had at the beginning of those 12 years. The woman who moved to Maple Grove and joined the reading group and befriended Miriam and watched and waited and calculated the moment. To act was not the woman who had stood at Ruth's funeral with her hands shaking at her sides. She was the woman that 12 years of patient work had produced. I became capable of the thing I needed to do by doing it. The 12 years were not only research, they were practice. They were the development of a capacity that I had not possessed at the beginning and that I would not have wanted to need. I am glad I have it now. I am sorry I needed it. I want to tell you about the bench dedication because I think it matters in a way that is difficult to explain. It was a Sunday in April. The park behind the library was full of the particular light that April produces in Missouri. The light that promises something after a long winter. And the cherry trees along the path were doing what cherry trees do in April, and the whole scene had an excess of beauty. That was almost embarrassing given what we were there for. There were about 30 people. Victor Okafor came in civilian clothes. Sandra Pruitt drove from Kansas City. Patricia came from Decatur. Beverly from Springfield. 3 of Ruth's friends from before the marriage who I had tracked down in the years after her death and who had remained in my life in the quiet ways of people connected by a shared loss. Our aunt from Arkansas, who was the only family we had left. Dean Callister was in a correctional facility in Jefferson City. I said a few words. Not many. I am not a person who gives speeches. I said. Ruth was my sister, and she was funny, and she was warm, and she was afraid of water since she was 7 years old, and she had not gone on that dock alone. I said she deserved to have her name said correctly, and it was now said correctly, and I was glad we were here. Then I sat down and someone else said something, and then there was food, which is what you do. And we stood in the April light, and we ate, and we talked about Ruth in the way that people finally talk about someone when the full truth is available to them. Patricia told a story about Ruth at the office where they had worked together, something Ruth had said to a difficult client that had been exactly right and perfectly timed. Everyone laughed. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed at a story about Ruth in 12 years without the laugh immediately being followed by grief. I sat on the bench afterward when most people had gone. I put my hand on the plaque, the letters of her name, Ruth Voss Callister. I thought about the biscuits. I thought about August. I thought about the way she said she loved me at the end of the call. I said her name once, not out loud. Inside, the way you say the names of people who are somewhere you cannot reach. Then I got up and helped carry the leftover food inside, and I locked up the library, and I drove home, and I made dinner. A person has to make dinner. The work continues. The life continues. Ruth is on the bench, and the file is corrected, and Dean Callister is in Jefferson City, and the library opens every morning at 8, and the people of Maple Grove come in to find the things they are looking for. I help them find things. That is still what I do. That is still what I am for. I have been called patient many times since the verdict. Patient as if it is a simple quality, as if I simply waited, calmly, for 12 years, and then the truth arrived. That is not what patience is. Patience is not waiting. Waiting is what you do when you have no other option. Patience is active. Patience is doing the work when the work produces nothing visible. Patience is making the call to Beverly for the 3rd time knowing she might not answer. Patience is filing the folder even when you do not know if the folder will ever be used. Patience is moving to Maple Grove and opening the library every morning when the person you are there for cannot see any of it. Patience is choosing every single day to believe that truth is worth the cost of finding it, even when you do not know when or if the finding will produce anything. It is not calm. There are days in 12 years when it is not calm at all. There are nights when the folder system looks like the compulsive project of someone who has lost perspective and cannot let go. There are mornings when the idea that any of it will ever matter feels like a story you are telling yourself to get out of bed. You get out of bed anyway. You open the folder. You make the call. You continue. That is patience, not a feeling. A practice. A daily choice to keep doing the thing that needs to be done regardless of whether it is producing visible results yet. The results came. They took 12 years to come. I did not know they were coming for most of those 12 years. I acted as if they were coming because the alternative was to stop, and I was not willing to stop. Ruth was not willing to be forgotten. I made sure of that. Every day for 12 years I made sure of that. It was the least I could do, and it was also the most I could do, and it turned out to be enough. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am the librarian. I find things. I found everything. That is the whole story. I did not tell you much about Dean and Ruth's marriage because Ruth protected it the way people protect things they are not sure are fixable. She did not want me to think badly of him before she had decided what she thought. That was Ruth, fair to a fault. Generous with her assessments of people who did not deserve the generosity. What I pieced together afterward, from Patricia's letters and from the neighbors and from Beverly and from the accounts of people who had watched them, together in those years, was a portrait I have sat with many times. He was attentive in the beginning, not lovingly, strategically, the kind of attention that is really assessment. He was learning her, learning what she valued and what she feared and what she would accept and what she would push back on. The learning period was what everyone mistook for devotion. After the wedding, the attention changed quality. He became unpredictable in the way of people who are managing a situation rather than living inside it. Warm some weeks and cold others. Supportive and then withdrawn. Generous and then withholding. The unpredictability was its own mechanism. She spent her energy trying to understand the pattern, and there was no pattern because there was no pattern to understand. The inconsistency was the method. It kept her focused inward on what she might have done to produce the coldness rather than outward on what he was actually doing. She did not tell me most of this at the time. She told me she loved him. She told me things were complicated. She told me she was working on it. The phone call in August was the only time she told me the truth clearly, and even then she qualified it. Said she was probably making things up. Said she did not want to be the woman who ran. I think about that qualification. She was afraid of seeming unreasonable. She had been made to doubt her own perception to the point that telling the truth required an apology. That is the specific achievement of a certain kind of cruelty, not just harm. Harm delivered in a way that makes the person being harmed uncertain whether they have the right to name it. She was afraid she was making things up. She was not making things up. He had insured her life 14 days before he killed her. She was not making anything up. I have thought about the original investigation many times, and I want to be clear about what I think of it because clarity matters here. The investigating officer was not malicious. He was not lazy in a simple sense. He was a practical man working in a small department with limited resources, and he was presented with a situation that had a readily available explanation, and a widower who was credible and grief-stricken, and he accepted the explanation. That is not a mystery. That is how human beings process information when they are not specifically trained to resist the pull of the available explanation. What he did not do was ask the question that should have been asked about Ruth's documented fear of water. If that question had been asked directly in the first days, in the way that Victor Okafor asked it 12 years later, the investigation might have gone differently. The question is simple. This woman is documented to be afraid of water. How did she come to be on a dock alone at night? Not a gotcha question, not an accusation, just the plain question that the available facts demanded. The question was not asked. The explanation was accepted. The file was closed. I do not believe the original officer was corrupt. I believe he was human, and that being human includes the tendency to accept what is offered when what is offered is plausible. What I know is that the tendency cost Ruth everything and cost me 12 years and cost Miriam her marriage and her assumptions about her life. Victor Okafor asked the question. Victor Okafor came to the original file without the original context, without the memory of Dean's performance at the funeral and the town's sympathy and the readily available explanation. And he read the file as a document rather than as a memory. He read it and he found the question that was in the document and he asked it. That is the difference between a closed case and a solved one, not evidence. Usually the evidence is already there. The difference is the question being asked. I had been asking the question for 12 years. Victor Okafor asked it in an official capacity, and the question produced the case that produced the verdict. I am not angry at the original investigation. I am tired of it. Those are different things. I want to tell you what the library looks like at night. Not the building specifically, but the feeling of it. I am sometimes the last one out. I do the final checks, the security rounds, the lights. On those evenings when I am walking through the building in the particular silence that libraries have after everyone has gone, I think about what a library actually is. It is a building full of things people thought were worth keeping. That is all it is. Someone looked at a thing and decided it had enough value to preserve and made it available to people who needed it. That decision, made over and over by different people across generations, produces a library. The accumulation of decisions that something is worth keeping. Ruth was worth keeping. The truth about Ruth was worth keeping. I kept it for 12 years the same way a library keeps things, not with sentimentality, with the practical conviction that what is true and what matters should be preserved and made accessible to whoever needs it. Victor Okafor needed it. The court needed it. The record needed it. I provided what I had kept. I walk through the library at night, and I think about all the things in it that someone decided were worth keeping, and I feel something that is not quite pride and not quite peace, but is somewhere between those two things. Something like rightness, the sense of a thing in its correct place. Ruth's truth is in its correct place now. The file says what it should say. The bench says what it says. The record is complete. I turn off the lights. I lock the door. I drive home through the streets of Maple Grove that are quiet at this hour. The elm trees and the old houses and the people inside them who are going about their ordinary lives without knowing any of this and not needing to. Some truths are not for everyone. Some truths are just for the record and for the person who needed them said. This one was for Ruth, it is said now. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am the librarian in Maple Grove. I find things. For 12 years, I found the truth about my sister. Nobody is afraid of the librarian. But the librarian found everything. That is the whole story. That is all of it. I've described the verdict. I want to tell you about the days before it because the trial was not just the ending. The trial was the first time the truth was said out loud in a public room, and that matters in a way the verdict alone does not. The prosecutor was a woman named Christine Halsey. She was young, probably 35, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been underestimated often enough to stop caring about the impression she made and to focus entirely on the work. She presented the evidence in a sequence that I had not known she would choose, and that turned out to be exactly right. She started not with the insurance policy, which I had expected, but with Ruth. She spent the first hour of the trial making Ruth visible to the 12 people in the jury box who had not known her. She showed them photographs. She played a home video that Ruth's friend had provided that showed Ruth at a gathering about a year before her death, laughing at something off camera, the specific laugh that anyone who knew her would have known immediately. She told them about the pool at 7 years old and the lifeguard and the understanding Ruth had reached with water after that. By the time Christine Halsey got to the insurance policy, the jury already knew who Ruth was. They were not evaluating an accidental drowning. They were evaluating what had happened to a specific woman whose specific self they had been introduced to. That is the difference between evidence and truth. Evidence can be technical. Truth is always personal. I sat in the gallery and I watched Christine Halsey do the thing that I had been doing for 12 years. Make Ruth visible, make her real. Insist on her specificity against the forces that had tried to reduce her to a file entry. Ruth would have liked Christine Halsey. She would have made a remark about her, something precise and funny that I would have laughed at and that nobody else would have heard. I sat in the gallery and I thought about what Ruth would have said, and I could not quite finish the thought because that is what happens when you are speaking half of a dialogue into silence. You get most of the way there and then you are alone with the unfinished sentence. I held the unfinished sentence and I listened to Christine Halsey, and I was glad Ruth was visible. Dean Callister's defense was competent and not adequate. His attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the witnesses were motivated by grief and that the insurance policy, while poorly timed, was not in itself proof of intent. He was right about all of these things in the narrow technical sense, and the jury found him guilty anyway because Christine Halsey had made Ruth real, and juries are human and humans understand. At a level below the technical, when the technical is being used to avoid the truth, when the verdict was read, Dean Callister was very still. He did not perform grief or outrage. He just was still in the way of someone who has run out of performances. I had seen him from across the courtroom for 11 days, and in those 11 days, he had managed his expression the way he had managed everything for 12 years, and in the moment the verdict was read, the management stopped, and what was underneath was just stillness. A man who had been running for 12 years and had stopped. I looked at him for the last time. Then I looked away. Ruth was on the bench. The record was corrected. I did not need to watch him anymore. The day after the verdict, I went to the library at 7:30 as usual. I opened the doors at 8. The Tuesday reading group met at 10. I helped a young man from the community college find sources for a paper on Missouri agricultural history. I answered 12 reference questions at the desk. I shelved 2 carts of returns in the afternoon. I ate lunch at my desk, a sandwich and an apple. I read the local paper, which had a front-page story about the verdict that I read once and set aside. At closing time, I did the security rounds. I turned off the lights section by section. I locked the front door. I drove home through the streets of Maple Grove. I made dinner. I sat at my kitchen table and ate it. I washed the dishes. I went to the spare room. I stood in the door of the spare room for a long time. The filing cabinet was there. The folders were there. 12 years of organized information in a room in my apartment. I closed the spare room door. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in a very long time. In the morning, I got up and went to work. The library opens at 8. People need help finding things. I am good at finding things. That is still true. That has not changed. What has changed is that the spare room is a spare room now, and the cabinet is empty, and Ruth is on the bench, and the file says what it should say. I am still here. The library is still here. The elm trees on the street outside are still doing what elm trees do in the spring. The new leaves coming in the particular pale green of April that means something after a long winter. I walk to work sometimes, past the bench in the park. I stop and put my hand on the plaque. Ruth Callister. The letters of her name in stone. Then I walk to the library. I open the doors at 8. I find things for people who are looking. That is the life. That is all of it. Nobody is afraid of the librarian, but the librarian found everything. My name is Eleanor Voss. That is the whole story. I have been careful in this telling not to spend too much time on Dean Callister. He does not deserve the attention. What he deserves is the sentence he received and the record that names what he did and the absence of any further thought from me. But I want to be precise about what he took, because the verdict does not cover all of it, and the things the verdict cannot cover deserve to be named. He took Ruth's life. That is in the record. He took 30 years from me. From the age of 22 when she died to the age of 54 when the verdict came, 32 years of my life have been shaped by what he did. Not entirely consumed by it, but shaped by it the way a river is shaped by the stone it flows around. The stone is always there. The river always adjusts. He took the person I would have been if I had been allowed to simply grieve and move forward. The version of me who does not have a spare room with filing cabinets. The version who spent those 12 years doing something other than finding evidence. I do not know who that version is. I am curious about her sometimes. I think she might have been a different kind of person. Not necessarily better, different. He took the conversations Ruth and I did not have. The 12 years of Sunday calls that did not happen. The things I would have told her and the things she would have told me. The jokes without a second person to finish them. The biscuits nobody brought. He took the version of her life she deserved. Not what she had, but what she should have had. The years after 26. What she would have become, who she would have been in her 30s and 40s. I will never know that version. She never got to be that version. That is what he took. Some of it is in the record. Most of it is not in any record. It lives in the people who loved her and who are diminished by her absence in ways that cannot be quantified or tried or sentenced. The verdict was justice in the conventional sense. The other costs are not addressed by any verdict because no verdict can address them. They are just what remains. What you carry after the case is closed and the bench is dedicated and the library opens at 8. I carry them. I have been carrying them. I will carry them for whatever years I have left in the way that people carry the weight of irreversible things, not with bitterness, with the knowledge that some things are simply true and the knowledge does not go away and you learn to live around it. I live around it. I walk past the bench. I open the library at 8. That is the life. That is all of it. Miriam is the person in this story I think about most often in the years since the verdict. Not because of what happened to her marriage or because of the disruption to her life, because of who she was in the moment I told her. I had expected a range of reactions: shock, denial, anger at the messenger, the impulse to defend the person she had built a life with because the alternative required dismantling everything. She did none of those things. She sat across from me at the library with her hands around her tea, and she listened, and she asked questions, and she accepted the information. Not without difficulty. I could see the difficulty in her face, the processing happening in real time. But she accepted it. She did not try to make the information fit a version of events that protected her. That is its own kind of courage. The willingness to let information change what you believed rather than defending the belief against the information. It is harder than it sounds. It requires accepting that you built something real on a foundation that was not what you thought it was, and that the building was still real and the foundation was still false, and both things can be true at the same time. She was a practical woman, she said. She would figure out what came next. I believed her. I still believe her. The quality of her response in that room told me she would be all right. Not in the sense of untouched, but in the sense of capable. She was capable. She was going to be all right. Her daughter was innocent of everything. That child was a person who was going to grow up knowing what her father had done and carrying that in the specific way that children carry their parents' wrongs. I thought about that child at the bench dedication. I thought about who would make sure she knew that the wrong was her father's and not hers to own. I hope Miriam does that for her. I believe she will. The innocent people in the orbit of people like Dean Callister are their own kind of cost. Miriam did not cause what happened to Ruth. The child did not cause what happened to Ruth. They were inside. The blast radius of a thing they had nothing to do with, and they will spend years figuring out how to live in the landscape it left behind. I think about Miriam on Tuesday evenings when I sit on the bench. I think I would like to know how she is. I think the letter we exchanged was the right amount, and I also think someday I might write her again. Not to reopen anything. Just to say I hope she and her daughter are well and that I think about them. I have not written yet. I might. When I cleared out the spare room after the trial, I spent an afternoon going through the folders before I emptied the cabinet. Not to revisit the evidence. To acknowledge what each folder represented. The folder labeled insurance policy. 14 days. The number that told me, before anything else existed, that something had been planned. The folder labeled Patricia. The letter from the shoebox indicator. Ruth's voice in writing 3 weeks before she died, saying she was not sure anymore that it was nothing. The folder labeled Beverly. A woman in a diner who had been carrying something since before Ruth's death and who had finally found the person to give it to. The folder labeled financial records. The money that moved in the weeks after Ruth died. Where it came from and where it went, and what it said about what had been intended. The folder labeled Maple Grove Observations. 3 years of watching from inside the community. What I had learned and when and what it had told me about the timing. The folder labeled Victor Okafor. Every conversation I had with him from the first call to the arraignment. Every question he asked me and every answer I gave. The record of the collaboration between the official investigation and the 12 years of unofficial work that had preceded it. The folder labeled Ruth, photographs. Her handwriting on a card she had sent me for my birthday 3 years before she died. A recipe for the biscuits, which she had sent me once when I asked for it, and which I had never successfully replicated. The receipt from a restaurant where we had lunched together the last time I saw her alive. I held that folder for a while. Not opening it, just holding it. Then I put it in a box. Not to throw it away. To take it out of the spare room and put it somewhere that was not the evidence room. The dining room shelf between some books. Where it could be the memory it actually was instead of the documentation it had been. The other folders went into a box for Victor Okafor's department. They were already part of the evidence record, but I sent him a clean set in case they were ever useful. He sent a thank you note that said the folders had been a model of how a citizen investigation should be conducted. I appreciated that. I put the note in the box on the dining room shelf next to the Ruth folder. The spare room is a spare room now. It has a chair in it and a lamp and a small bookcase with books I have been meaning to read. It is a room for living in instead of a room for evidence. I sit in it sometimes. I read. The elm tree outside the window moves in the wind. The neighborhood is quiet. The library is 3 blocks away and will open at 8 in the morning. This is the life. This is what is on the other side of 12 years. A spare room with a chair, a bench with a name on it. A record that says what it should say. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am the librarian. I found everything. That is the whole story. That is all of it.